Thank you for joining Stanford Social Innovation Review's webinar, Channeling Change, Making Collective Impact Work. It's the latest in their series of webinars called SSIR Live. I'm Eric Nee, Managing Editor of Stanford Social Innovation Review and moderator of today's webinar. Stanford Social Innovation Review is published at the Center for Philanthropy and Civil Society at Stanford University. We launched SSIR Live to provide a forum for people involved in social innovation to discuss important topics. We host new webinars about once a month, choosing topics from among Stanford Social Innovation Review's most popular and important articles. So keep your eyes open for our upcoming events. Thank you very much for joining us today. Before getting started, I want to go over a few housekeeping items. If you are having any trouble with sound, click on the refresh button on the left-hand side of your screen. For any technical difficulties, you can click on the help button in the top right-hand corner. The webinar will last 1 hour. The first 35 to 40 minutes will be a presentation by our three featured speakers, followed by about 20 to 25 minutes for questions and answers. Please submit your question by keying it into the box on the bottom left corner of your screen. Your question is anonymous. The webinar will be accessible 3 hours from now by clicking on the same link you used today. You can freely access the webinar as many times as you'd like over the next year. Today, John Kania, Kat Allen, and Mark Van Emeringen will discuss their experiences and the lessons that they have learned about how organizations can work together effectively to create social change. A year and a half ago, SSIR published an article by John Kania and Mark Kramer of FSG titled Collective Impact. That article proved to be one of the most popular articles we have ever published. It was the right article at the right time. Organizations of all types, foundations, nonprofits, businesses, and government, were partnering more and more, and Collective Impact offered a framework for how to do so more effectively. Since then, hundreds of organizations have reached out to FSG to talk about their efforts to use collective impact and to get more guidance on how to implement these principles. Recently, FSG wrote a follow-on article that was published on SSIR's website called Channeling Change, Making Collective Impact Work. Today's webinar grows out of that article. Joining us today is John Kania, co-author of both Collective Impact and Channeling Change, who's going to provide an overview of what FSG has learned about implementing collective impact. He is joined by two people who have been actively involved in collective impact initiatives. Kat Allen, co-chair of Communities That Care Coalition of Franklin County and the North Quabbin, and Mark Van Emeringen, CEO of the Global Alliance for Improved Nutrition. Each of them will provide their on-the-ground experiences of what works and what doesn't. It's going to be a great discussion. Let me now turn it over to John, who will begin the presentation.
Great. Thanks, Eric. If we could have the next slide, please. Well, hello, everyone. I'm very glad to join Eric and our two panelists, Kat and Mark, to wade into the effective practices around implementing collective impact efforts. Collective impact first made its public debut in the winter 2011 issue of Stanford Social Innovation Review. But the seeds of the thinking that led to collective impact began as early as 2004 when we first published an article in Stanford Social Innovation Review called Leading Boldly, in which we discussed how funders could help lay the foundations for large-scale change. Since then, we've moved to deepen our thinking around the conditions for large-scale change efforts through additional knowledge dissemination, much of it through SSIR, and also through consulting support for collective impact efforts in a variety of sectors, including education reform, economic development, juvenile justice reform, teen substance abuse, and environmental sustainability. Could I have the next slide, please? Now, in our first article on collective impact, we defined the 5 conditions that distinguished what we called collective impact efforts from other types of collaboration and have led to efforts that were really achieving large-scale social and environmental impact. And the 5 conditions are listed here. Those who've read the articles probably could name these by heart. Common agenda, shared measurement, mutually reinforcing activities, continuous communication, and backbone support organizations. Now, these conditions are in some respects easy to say, but very hard to do for those of you who've attempted this work. And in terms of implementing these, the two that we get the most questions about that are in some respects are, the newest qualities of high-performing collaborations are shared measurement and the notion of having a backbone organization. Several months ago, FSG presented a webinar focused on shared measurement called Implementing Shared Measurement. And if you missed that webinar and want to learn more about shared measurement, you can download it at fsg.org. It's an hour long, and it would be an hour well spent if shared measurement is something that you're interested in learning more about. We wanted to focus today's discussion with Kat and Mark on going deep on what it means to build an effective backbone organization and effective backbone function. In our experience, the failure to invest sufficient resources in the backbone and the activities that the backbone performs is probably the #1 reason that collaborative efforts fail. So what I'd like to do is share some of the specifics on critical activities that we see backbone organizations performing in collective impact efforts. And then Mark from GAIN and Kat from Communities That Care will share with you their experiences in building and implementing the backbone function. Next slide, please. So first, we're going to focus on the top of this slide, the 6 essential functions to what backbone organizations do. We continue to, as I said earlier, research collective impact, and we really, have gone deep in terms of trying to understand the functions that backbone organizations play. We're continuing to consult, as I said earlier, in this arena. And we've really identified 6 essential functions that we believe that high-performing backbones play in terms of bringing about change at scale. And they're listed across the top here. The first is guiding vision and strategy. And what we mean by this are a couple of things. One, that the backbone participates in helping to build a common understanding of the problem that needs to be addressed. And that from the beginning and ongoing through the effort, the collective impact effort, the backbone is providing strategic guidance to develop a common agenda and serving as a thought leader or standard bearer, if you will, for the initiative. The second essential function is supporting aligned activities. Now, what we found is that there actually are a lot of different sort of specific sets of things that backbones are doing when they're supporting aligned activities. For example, part of this is coordinating and facilitating partners' continuous communication and collaborative work. Part of this is convening partners and the community and external stakeholders. Sometimes this is about catalyzing and incubating new initiatives or collaborations that are needed in order to sort of achieve better and quicker impact in the issue area being addressed. Sometimes this is providing technical assistance to sort of build the management and administrative capability of the specific partners, nonprofit organizations that are actually involved in the initiative. Sometimes this is creating paths for new partners to come on board or in seeking out opportunities for alignment with other efforts that sort of dovetail with the specific collective impact effort you're involved with. So there's a lot around supporting aligned activities. The third effective area for sort of effective practice with backbones is establishing shared measurement practices. Now, this is, again, it's a couple things. It's collecting, analyzing, interpreting, and reporting data. It's catalyzing and developing shared measurement systems, and importantly, and not to be underestimated, in many instances, it's providing technical assistance for partners to build, the partners' data capacity and capability. The fourth major activity that we see backbones playing is building public will, being able to frame the problem to create a sense of urgency, engaging the community, and producing and managing communications. The fifth activity is advancing policy, and really, it's not only about sort of developing a policy agenda associated with the issue, it's also about sort of aligning key partners behind the policy agenda. And finally, the sixth major activity is really mobilizing funding. I think we've seen effective backbone organizations be really strong and effective in terms of bringing additional funding to the initiative. So those are the six major activities that we've seen. If you look at the center of this slide, one of the questions we get often is, what type of organization should be a backbone? Should it be a nonprofit? Should it be a new organization? Should it be a government agency or intermediary like the United Way? Can multiple organizations play that backbone role? And the reality is that we have seen all of these types of organizations play this role. I think if you look at just the 4 that we've listed here, each structure has its pros and cons, and we talk about those in our most recent article. The best structure for housing the backbone is really going to be situation specific depending on the dynamics surrounding the issue and the geography. The last thing I'll mention about backbone organizations is what you see on the bottom of this slide, which is really that regardless of the type of organization playing the role of backbone, we see 2 essential core requirements for backbone success. The first requirement is that backbone staff must be capable of strong and adaptive leadership. They need to be influential enough, on the one hand, to keep all parties together in what is often a really, really messy process, while they also need to be willing to play a behind-the-scenes role when that's appropriate so that the key stakeholders and key partners in the initiative can own the initiative's success. The second requirement that a backbone needs to sort of see and be a part of is that it needs to be well-resourced. And one of the things we would point out is that despite what's just incredible growing interest in collective impact by all sectors, there are few funders that are really yet stepping forward to support backbones on the issues they care about. We do see a number of visionary funders who are interested in systems-changing strategies that are really embracing the concept of collective impact and are committing to multi-year funding for backbones. And I think what these funders understand is that backbones can provide huge leverage. Typically, they're going to cost much less than 1% of the resources going into any particular issue, but you really need to think about them dramatically increasing the ability of the other 99% of the resources to actually have effectiveness and impact. So now I'd like to turn things over to our 2 panelists, Mark and Kat. But before doing that, I'd like to note that the 2 panelists that we have here today are really probably about as dramatically different in the scopes and issues that they are addressing in their collective impact efforts as one could find. GAIN is a global effort that's reduced nutritional deficiencies among 530 million poor people across the globe. So it's global in nature. Communities That Care is an effort operating on a very targeted geography of rural western Massachusetts, but in its targeted geography has had impact at scale, reducing teenage drinking, binge drinking by 31%. So we're first going to start with Mark Amerington from GAIN. Mark, what can you tell us about GAIN's efforts and your role in terms of playing the backbone?
Thanks, John, for that introduction. I'm going to just walk through over the next few minutes a bit about GAIN's background, what it's achieved, how it's performed this backbone organizational role, and what are the kind of changes we've had to make to work in this way. First of all, maybe just to say, GAIN was created about 10 years ago at a time when malnutrition had fallen off the global agenda. And at that time, we're getting close to 1 billion people suffering from hunger and malnutrition, and another billion suffering from micronutrient deficiencies. And it was a period where the whole nutrition sector really did not work well together. And as a result of this not being a dominant issue on the global agenda and the sector not working well, there was very limited investment. At the same time, there was this strong feeling that we needed a new way of looking at the problem. We needed some comprehensive approaches, some new innovative models, and we needed partnerships. The problem is so big that there was no one organization or player that could do this on its own. And at the same time, there was this recognition that we need to bring in the private sector more into the discussion, and how do we make markets work to improve nutrition. So this led really to this desire to have a new champion, to bring some urgency to the problem, and to raise some new resources. So in 2002, GAIN was established at the UN Special Session on Children. Initially, the organization was based in the UN system and then moved outside to become an international organization based in Switzerland. And in that past 10 years, we've really focused on getting programs going on the ground that would really address undernutrition specifically, and trying to get some new innovative models that could be sustainable, and new partnerships that could work that would really reach our target group, which were women and children under 2. So a typical program, for example, would be fortifying staple foods, where we would cover the whole population in, let's say, a country like South Africa, adding micronutrients, vitamin minerals to maize or wheat flour, and where we might make an investment of $3 or $4 million, and we would leverage about $25 to $30 million from the government and the private sector to come out with a large program that would roll out over 5 years. Another example would be where we would work with partners to provide single-serving sachets of micronutrients for children 6 to 24 months. And so in a place like Bangladesh, this would be rolled out through a big NGO like BRAC. So in the past 10 years, I think we've achieved quite a bit. From the operational standpoint, we were able to build quite a strong organization that's able to innovate, build collaboration platforms, and also able to really measure performance and show some results. And some of these results have been significant. I think we have catalyzed and support over 50 large-scale collaborative partnerships involving multiple stakeholders, and these have been in about 30 countries, mainly high-burden countries in Africa and Asia, where today we're reaching over 500 million people. And some of the results have been, significant reductions in micronutrient deficiencies in places like China, South Africa, Kenya, up to 30%. So that's a little bit about what we do. Let me turn to the next slide to talk a bit about some of the key backbone functions. And I think for each of these, it's important to say that they've evolved over time, and there have been challenges, and there's quite a lot of adaptation as one goes. But if we looked at guiding vision and strategy, one of the key needs, given the lack of consensus in the nutrition sector early on, was to try and help create some common vision and some agreement on priorities. And this led us to work in some areas on common guidelines. Sometimes that got adopted into normative standards. Other times to create multi-sector platforms to bring all the stakeholders together. Again, a lot of challenges in an area where many times no one wanted to be coordinated or no one wanted to be led. So in another area where we played a key role in is really around getting alignment in activities. And here I think we've found have achieved some good results, particularly at the country level, where we're able to catalyze bringing stakeholders together in alliances. And in the area of staple food fortification, we have developed almost 20 multi-sectoral alliances which oversee the whole national effort. Or in the area of maternal, infant, young child nutrition, we've been able to work at bringing together all the stakeholders. And again here, I think what we've learned has been to really be focusing on the issue and less on presenting gain as an organization, and I think that helped us in a great deal. Another core function has been really advancing policy, and here there's a number of different tracks that we've worked on. For example, working with partners to convince donor governments to invest more in nutrition, like we've done with presentations to the U.S. Congress, or working in countries to actually get them to adopt national laws and regulations that would be game changers, like in places like Uganda. The last area I would highlight has really been around mobilizing funding. And here I think, we've taken a number of different tracks, and I think we've been fairly effective. One has been really, how do we increase the overall pot for the whole nutrition sector? So not just thinking about ourselves, but the whole sector continues to be significantly under-resourced. So how do we raise that? But secondly, we focus on how do we crowd in new investment from the private sector and government so that they actually start to put more money into these programs. GAIN itself has raised close to $400 million from donors and been very fortunate, and I think without that we would not have been able to play a lot of this role. But the last thing we focused on quite a bit on is what are some of the new innovative financing mechanisms that can make a difference to bring more money into the sector. Let me turn to the next slide. I think one of the key things has been that to play this role, we really had to transform the organization quite dramatically over the 10-year period. And I think there are three key areas where we have really invested in this. First has been at the governance level. Initially, we had a board that had all the stakeholders around the table who were also recipients of the money in many cases, and we found that, with conflicts of interest around the board, we really could not progress the way we needed to. So we restructured the board to have a very much more narrowly focused board that concentrated on GAIN's business and a partnership council that brought the stakeholders together. The second thing has been really around building out the secretariat or the organizational platform. Initially, GAIN was very focused on being a centralized operation run out of Geneva, and we quickly realized that to be an effective play this backbone role, we needed a global platform, which led us to decentralize quite significantly into the countries we were working in. And at the same time, we realized, initially we were very much focused on giving out grants or sub-granting money that we raised from donors, and we moved to realize that a lot of impacts were not driven by grants, only that there were multiple ways of driving impact, some of it, for example, advocacy or technical assistance. The third thing we realized is to play this role, you need scale. Given all the areas that we're working in that backbone role, you need to have areas of specialization. So, we focused on building business units or initiatives where we have strong areas of specialization, but at the same time that we really needed to have a very strong management cadre in our team. Almost a third of our team were our managers, but in addition to that, we needed a strong multi-sectoral team which has a number of disciplines around the table so we could provide technical assistance. So those are some of the things that were part of the transformation. The other part was that we really had to invest a huge amount of effort in our strategy and in restructuring the organization. So that's a bit about how we've changed to play this role. A lot of challenges. I think the one you mentioned earlier still is one of the biggest ones for us, is that most of the donors don't see this backbone function. They're very much focused on project funding, and so getting this to play this role really effectively, you need funders to be investing in the core and in the institution, and most are still quite reluctant to do that. But let me stop there and turn back to you, John.
Sure. Well, that's terrific. I mean, you said a lot there that's really fascinating. One thing you mentioned, Mark, was that part of your role was addressing the situation that no one wanted to be coordinated and no one wanted to be led. And I think that's something we hear from a lot of different folks who are attempting to start up collective impact efforts. And I wonder if you have any specific strategies you might share or experiences in terms of how do you address that situation? No one wants to be coordinated. No one wants to be led. How do you shift the dynamic?
I think it's you need to create an enabling environment where everybody feels they're an equal player at the table, and that it's really not pushing your own brand or not pushing your own interests, and I think waiting for the group to step up. And so a lot of it also depends on the time period you're working in. Some strategies like that work very well in certain conjunctures where everyone is seeing the urgency, but where no one sees the urgency, you just have to wait for the right time as well. So you can't force these things. But I think, today this sector has come together in a big way under the Scale Up Nutrition movement, and there's some very clear leadership, and, it's working really well. 10 years ago was quite a different story. So it's really, it's adapting, trying things, looking at the environment you're working in, and trying to facilitate others. I think the last thing I would say, it's really also a clear recognition that, when you start to see that your partner's success is your success, that tends to be a bit of a game changer.
Yeah, you know, I think we've heard that from it. It's great to hear you articulate it that way, because I know it truly, as I said earlier, you know, as an effective backbone leader, you have to be able to influence people, bring them together, but you need to be willing to play that behind-the-scenes role and really see success as your partner's success, which is just exactly as you described it. Now we're going to shift from a global level, the global level, and an effort in GAIN that has impacted 500 million people. And we're going to move to rural Massachusetts, a region of 80,000 people, over 800 square miles, and visit with Kat Allen from Communities That Care. Kat, the floor is yours.
Hi, thank you. Thank you, Eric and John and Mark. I'm really honored to be presenting here today, and I wanted to say happy first day of spring to everyone who's listening. And as you just heard, I'm Kat Allen, and I'm one of the co-chairs of the Communities That Care Coalition. We're located in western Massachusetts, and we're as close to Albany as we are to Boston. We serve 30 rural towns, and that's in comparison to GAIN's 30 countries. And as you just heard, we serve a population of about 80,000 people over 800 square miles. Our coalition was formed in 2002 in order to address the high rates of youth substance use in our area. And we got our start, one organization, Community Action, was starting down this path because there was a prominent local parent that stepped forward and defined the issue, and then the local community foundation came forward with money, and a local business came forward with some money as well. And on the other hand, another organization, the Community Coalition for Teens, got a Drug-Free Communities federal grant to do a collective impact, not called that at the time, but initiative on this. So these two organizations realized that they were about to head down the same path and decided, obviously, that they should co-lead this initiative. So both agencies dedicate some staff time to the backbone function. Our bylaws stipulate that each co-host agency needs to dedicate at least 4 hours per week to running the coalition, but how much more than that depends on who has what grant fund at the time to fund the backbone kinds of activities at that time. And we've tended to have, I would say, about 2 FTEs, 2 full-time equivalents dedicated to these backbone functions. But that has been spread across at least a half dozen people in nearly as many different agencies. So I guess we have a lot of bones in our backbone here. So we've been working together for about 9 years now, along with dozens of other agencies in our community. And if we're going to follow the anatomical analogy, these are the arms and legs of the coalition. You know, you can imagine the arms are reaching out, implementing strategies, and the legs are the place where the feet are hitting the pavement. So, but we've been doing this for about 9 years, and if you can flip to the next slide, as you can see in this next slide, we've seen a 31% decrease in youth binge drinking rates, a 32% decrease in teen smoking, and an 18% reduction in youth marijuana use. These are 8th, 10th, and 12th grade numbers from 2003 to 2011. So we can't by any means presume that all of this reduction is due to our work, but we are hopeful that we've played a role in this really encouraging decline. So if you can flip to the next slide, Eric and the folks at FSG have asked me to speak about how we perform the 6 essential functions, and we certainly have performed all of these 6 essential functions listed here with varying degrees of success. So starting here on the upper left, I think we've done a particularly good job in guiding vision and strategy. We've created a community action plan that we refer to and update regularly. We carry it around in our backpacks. We're sort of more of a backpack community than a briefcase community out here, and tote bags and so on, but it comes out at community meetings, and we regularly use this community action plan to guide our actions. And I want to just mention that you can find this action plan on our website, and we're happy for you to take it and adapt it or use any part of it in any way that's useful to you. So we rely on this community action plan also as the primary vehicle to help us to identify and to support aligned activities. This is sort of our method of aligning activities is through this community action plan. I believe we've also done a really good job at establishing shared measurement practices. About 5 years ago, we hired a half-time evaluation coordinator onto our tiny staff at our co-host organization because we and the coalition believe so strongly in the important role that high-quality local data has in helping us plan our strategic directions. So our evaluation coordinator has been a real asset and resource to the community. She regularly helps our partner agencies run special reports from our teen health survey and from our parent survey. She can prepare presentations for partner agencies, and she really works to get the data, quote unquote, off the shelf and into the business of planning and evaluating effective programs. I think as we've been able to measure success in our efforts and see the impact of our work, I think that has really helped us to build public will. I think we're helping people to see that their efforts are important and believe that their efforts are important and do indeed make a difference, and that prevention is important and does indeed make a difference. So in terms of advancing policy, we're doing more and more in this area. We do work with our state and national partners to support state and national policy issues, and we've been working more and more with our local town governments, with our alcohol licensing boards, with our boards of health, to advance public policy on a local level. And we're also looking at policies and have been looking at policies in schools and the workplace. This is another place where we can really advance policy and make a difference. Where we've been least successful lately is in mobilizing funding. Over the years, we've helped to mobilize more than $5 million towards the strategy in our community action plan, but this includes not just the backbone, but also the arms and the legs. However, with the downturn in the economy and with several of our largest, most stable funding sources coming to an end, we're currently in real danger of losing our backbone funding. So as a coalition, we're currently taking on a new initiative using our existing structures and our existing plus new partners to improve youth nutrition and physical activity. We're really trying to capitalize on areas of overlap between substance abuse prevention and nutrition and physical activity, things like promoting healthy interactive family dinners that can have an impact in both of those areas. And we're trying to do this so that we can easily use the same backbone and structures for both initiatives without having to stretch so far that we find ourselves off balance. So I do also want to say that if anyone has any leads for us on funding sources, please do share this with us. But that is the area that we've probably been struggling with the most lately. So if you can switch to the next slide. As you can see in this next slide, there are a number of different bodies that meet regularly in our coalition, and pretty much the on-the-ground strategy implementation happens at the work group level, and then we have a coordinating council that's our decision-making body. And all of these groups are made up of lots of different people from lots of different agencies in lots of different community sectors. And they all have their tentacles out to their own sectors, to their own agencies, and so on. We also have a regional school health task force that specifically serves to link the coalition's efforts to the schools, since this is such an essential place for us to be well linked. So in order to keep communication flowing between the different groups, a few different things happen. Work group chairs participate in the coordinating council and regularly give updates at the coordinating council meetings. The coalition co-chairs are on each of the work groups' listservs, and when we aren't able to go to meetings, we stay in touch through those listservs. And the full coalition meets together twice a year, all the work groups, any interested community members, and this is a chance for work groups to give updates and to highlight specific strategies that they're working on. So this system overall has worked really well for us. Certain things have, of course, changed or ebbed and flowed over the years, but overall the structure has been appropriate for us and has been appropriately flexible to adapt to our needs. I think having two backbone organizations has occasionally presented minor challenges, but for the most part has given the coalition additional flexibility and resiliency. You know, if you imagine it's the backbone, if we only had one bone in our spine, we might not be as flexible. So for us, having this level of collaboration built right into the leadership makes it truly a community endeavor. So I will leave it at that for now, and I'll pass it back over to John to make sure we have plenty of time for questions.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Kat.
Thanks.
You know, you asked, or you addressed one question I was going to ask, because I know people ask us all the time about this dimension of, you know, could we have more than one backbone? And it seems like you've been able to make that work and, in fact, see that as potentially strength.
Yeah. As I said, you know, everything has its pros and its cons, but for the most part, this has been a real strength for us because funding and resources are so hard to come by out where we are. When one organization is a little harder up on their luck, the other organization is often in a better position, and so it just adds that extra piece of resiliency. Not to mention that our two organizations are quite different and have different strengths and weaknesses, and one is a governmental body, one is a nonprofit, so that also lends us some flexibility in applying for different kinds of grants and so on.
Right, interesting. Now, it's also interesting, you know, one of the things that we've seen with collective impact work is, and we talk about this in the second article, that, you know, the boundaries for how you define the issue, are a judgment call, and in fact are rather porous and can evolve over time. So it's interesting to hear that you have evolved from initially sort of focused on teen substance abuse prevention to youth nutrition and physical activity. Has that meant that you're engaging, you know, probably with some of the same organizations, or are there new organizations that are now part of the collective?
Great question. Yes, we started by asking all of our existing partners how they felt about this, and their answer was, yes, we've always been here for the mission, which is improving youth health and well-being. Our mission is not specific to youth substance abuse prevention, and yes, this does fit with our work well enough. So we started with our existing partners, and then hearing a resounding yes, we've then reached out to new partners, and I think ultimately this will lend additional strength to our substance abuse prevention initiative, to have these additional partners who might not have the time to come to the table specifically for substance use, but their work is more in nutrition or physical activity, and still they have something they can add to all of the work.
Yeah, that's neat. You know, looking at this picture here, and Mark showed his organizational structure earlier for GAIN at a global level, what's interesting is that with both organizations, you're sort of, the way you're organized, and we talked about this in the second article, is, you know, in the way the collective work typically gets done is sort of this cascading levels of linked collaborative work. That's the term that we use. And, you know, I'm curious, looking at this picture, you've got a couple of different work groups. You know, how is it that these different work groups are linked, and what is the role that, you know, the backbones play in that?
That's a great question. For us, these three work groups, for the most part, we almost always have had a co-chair for these work groups at one of the two co-host organizations, one of the two co-backbone organizations. And so that helps facilitate, you know, daily communication between the work groups when we're all in the office, and we have sort of cubicle enough setup that we overhear all of our phone conversations and so on for the most part. Now, the parent education work group has had two co-chairs from outside of the backbone organizations, a parent volunteer and someone from a mental health organization who's not one of the backbones. And that has taken more of a concerted effort, more, you know, just continuous email and phone calls, just to remind yourself that we need to stay in close communication.
Yeah. Now, Mark and Carrie, I don't know if you can flip back to GAIN's organizational structure, but you're sort of implementing this cascading levels of linked collaboration at a global level, down to and through countries. And I'm curious how, if you have any thoughts and, you know, strategies that you can share for how you make that work. It just seems like, wow, that's pretty complex.
Yeah, it is pretty complex. I mean, I think at one level, you know, we use our, you know, overarching governance structures that have a lot of people from, you know, countries and key stakeholders and global players and donors in those structures. So that is at one level works fairly well, but it's quite difficult to bring all the pieces together. It's really more, trying to get alignment in countries, amongst the key groups that we're trying to influence, and that itself doesn't necessarily link to those countries. Sometimes come together to share knowledge and experiences, but I think we find that the political economy and the settings in each country are so unique. It's hard to translate what we would be doing in Afghanistan to Bangladesh to Kenya,
right.
And in an ongoing way. So a lot of that integration happens more at the secretariat level, where we actually try and assemble all these lessons. And I guess one of our challenges too is that things often take a long time to show results, to come together, to get to scale. We're looking at sometimes 5 to 10 years. So a lot happens on the way there. So it's a bit of a different approach. And I think one of the areas perhaps where we've been less successful has really been in the extent to which we've invested in building our communication platforms between countries and what's happening in the Secretariat. And we've tended to use a lot of events to bring people together and share, but in terms of a really effective platform that is communicating on an ongoing way and using new media, now that the internet is so available in many of these countries, that hasn't happened to the extent it should have, and that's something we're investing in quite a bit now.
Right. That makes a lot of sense. Great. Well, I know many of you have questions in our listening audience, and I'll turn things back to Eric in a second. But just to provide some observations on what we've heard from Mark and Kat, I think it's pretty clear that the organizations that they represent, the backbones in these respective efforts, are essential to overcoming what we call, we identified in our first article as this phenomenon of isolated impact. If we want collective impact, if we want literally hundreds of organizations in some cases working in an aligned and coordinated way, this backbone function is critical, and we've talked about the 6 essential functions. One sort of observation on collective impact in general is, one way I like to talk about collective impact is that relative to other collaborations, it's more disciplined, it's more structured, it's more rigorous on the one hand. On the other hand, collective impact efforts are only going to succeed over the medium and long term in creating large-scale change if they're flexible and organic. And you heard Mark and Kat both talk a bit about how their organizations and the efforts had evolved over time. And it's absolutely critical for collective impact efforts to have that level of fluidity and flexibility. And there's no way they could be both rigorous and disciplined and also flexible and adaptable without this very strategic function of backbones to continue to sort of help organize and align things, but also importantly to sort of be this, the bridge that brings strategic learning and communication to the core of the effort. So again, literally hundreds of organizations can benefit and align and coordinate their action. So Eric, I'm going to turn it back to you for questions from the audience.
Thank you, John. We have had a lot of questions, which is terrific. I think the presentations from John, Mark, and Kat were quite interesting and provocative. So for the next 15-20 minutes, I'm going to pose questions from the audience. So if you have any, please submit them by keying your question into the box on the bottom left corner of the screen. We obviously won't have time to field everyone's question, but we will get to as many as we can. One of the questions that we had come up quite a bit was around funding. I think both Kat and Mark mentioned that funding was a difficult problem. So I'd like to pose this question to all three of you. John, maybe you can start by providing kind of an overview, and then Mark and Kat speak to it more specifically. What seems to be the reason why raising money for a backbone organization is so challenging? Why is it that funders don't see the need for this? What are successful strategies and approaches for convincing funders that it is important to contribute money to this, not just on a one-shot basis, but on an ongoing basis, so that these organizations can continue to operate over the long run. So, John, why don't you start off answering that, and then I'd like to hear from Mark and Kat.
Great. Yeah, I mean, I think it is one of the most essential things that has to happen if collective impact is really to gather steam, is that we need visionary funders who understand that to move from isolated to collective impact, this function is so key, as is shared measurement. And I think, the simple answer that, we observe is that funders are just, they fund direct service or comfortable funding direct service and advocacy, but this is a new area, and in some respects, it is, and it feels like infrastructure, and that's just an area where funders have traditionally not invested as much. Strategies that I've seen be effective, I do think, it is really critical to have a lead funder, and interested to hear about Kat and Mark's experiences, but I think, having a visionary funder who understands this, who can help recruit other funders, from the standpoint of, the collective, it's actually critical and important to have other funders involved and not just, to be associated with one specific funder. So I think that is one of the critical, components, is if you can have one key visionary funder. Often I think it's real critical, particularly for place-based initiatives, to have a local funder who really gets and understands and can in fact participate in the effort as well. Mark? Kat?
Yeah, thanks. It's Mark Van Emeringen. I mean, I think, I think that one of the real challenges around raising money for this has been that I think over the last 15 years, donors have been really looking for, return on investment linked specifically to the impacts they want to achieve. And the impacts tend to be, related to the specific area of involvement. And a lot of effort has been going into sort of measuring and coming up with indicators to measure those specific impacts. And so I think as that, and I think that's part of, funders starting to look more, operate more as if they're in the private sector. And I think with that, we really moved away from, looking at what's the organization that actually has to exist to deliver that impact. And if you look at many grant proposals or funding proposals, everybody assumes somebody else is paying for the core costs of that organization and isn't prepared to put it in their project. So that is the biggest challenge, is this projectization and very limited focus on investment and this assumption that the organization will survive. I think from Gaines' side, having a lead funder, which in our case was the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, was really quite important. In the sense that I don't think, in the sense that it gave kind of space to do some of the things that we wanted to do as more of a backbone organization, while at the same time focusing on results. I think there is kind of in some ways a maturity that is amongst funders too. I think those that are more mature, we can see that, for example, with DFID UK today, where they're actually they're starting to see that it's really organizations that drive impacts, and they're prepared to give challenge grants to high-performing organizations that can achieve these things. So I think there's some hope and some shift that's happening out there, but I do think there needs to be a lot of advocacy that really starts to raise the issue that projectizing everything and focusing on very specific returns of investment will not lead to the same kind of impacts as if you're investing in organizational platforms that can achieve major game changers in sectors. Thanks.
So, Kat, you don't have a Gates Foundation, I presume, out there in Western
No, we
Massachusetts.
don't, nor do we have a local foundation that really can provide this kind of backbone support. We've been fortunate that in substance abuse prevention, the federal government has really been this lead funder, this sort of visionary with the Drug-Free Communities funding that has helped to sort of spark this kind of collective impact work. And one thing I would say is it's not just funding, but it's longevity of funding. It's that stable funding. We've been fortunate to have 10 years of funding, and I don't even want to look at one-year grants that come open because you can't even begin to do collective impact work in a short time period. I'm really hopeful that this article and this webinar is sort of helping to promote the idea that funders should look at funding backbone organizations. But I also think, for us in backbone organizations, we really need to be focusing on that measurement. Of course, funders want to make a difference, and we need to be able to prove that we can make a difference. So that's, I feel like I'm not well poised to answer because we're really struggling with this right now, but that's the best I can think of for now.
So does the government...
Other thing I would add to that, Kat, and both Mark and Kat brought up the issue of being able to measure impact. I think we're seeing that for the backbone organization, there's measurement at two levels. One is the measurement of progress against the issue, and I think again both GAIN and Communities That Care within their respective issues and geographies can really demonstrate that the issue has moved, that there's sort of been scale impact. Then the question becomes, well, what contribution did the backbone have to that? And we're in the midst of some additional research to understand, how do we think about the progress of the backbone towards bringing about systems change. And if you go back to the 6 essential activities that both Mark and Kat talked about and that I talked about, we're in the process of, really, building out the theory of change around those 6 activities, the if-then, and being able to, sort of come up with a way that we can evaluate the impact of backbones. And that is research that's in process, but by this fall, certainly, we expect to be able to release that to the field.
I had just one follow-up question for Kat. You said that the government's been your lead funder, so do they know that they're funding a backbone organization?
They don't know the term as far as, I'm really hoping that the Drug-Free Communities folks and the collective impact, folks at FSG are going to, be communicating well. I'm hoping that there's some folks from Drug-Free Communities on this call and reading the articles. They don't necessarily have the terms and so on, but they definitely have the concept and have had the concept, that we had 10 years of funding to fund what is essentially a collective impact initiative. So, and they really outline that for communities that get this funding, and there's, I believe, been over 800 around the country, are required to get participation from all different sectors of the community, and are required to do a shared measurement process and so on.
Right. Which brings up another interesting question. We had quite a few questions about what types of organizations can play the role of a backbone. John, in your slide you said, well, all can, which in theory I suppose is correct, although in practice it seems that most of them have been nonprofit organizations of one type, whether they're existing or newly created or it's a foundation or something. There don't seem to be a lot of examples of for-profit businesses or government agencies playing that role. Is that true, and if so, why is that? John, I guess let me start with you.
Yeah, I don't think we've seen any examples of for-profit organizations playing that role. Government agencies, within, for example, in the United States, within state governments, and even within local governments, we have seen government agencies playing the backbone role. I think it is tricky because, to some degree, government agencies have less room to maneuver, and you have more political influence over specifically what they do. But we have the good thing about government is it has capacity, it has capability, it has expertise. The Childhood Obesity Initiative that we mentioned in our first article, Shape Up Somerville, started as an external backbone but migrated into the state government, into the city government. And we have seen in some regions like health or some issue areas like health where state governments are, and even juvenile justice reform, we've seen state governments playing that backbone role. It's a little bit trickier for governments, again, because they have less room to maneuver, but they do have the capacity and capability. I think it really comes down to context. The reason we can't say it must be this or that organization, because every community has, its own dynamics, political dynamics in terms of, you've got to be perceived as a neutral and even-handed party, and you've got to have the capacities around adaptive leadership skills, data collection, communication, and you can't sort of generalize and say that one type of organization has that capacity. It really varies depending on the organizations themselves.
Well, and you sort of wrote off, or you dismissed the for-profits playing that role. Is that why is that, and do you think that could change? I mean, FSG has been a big advocate of this notion of shared value, and might we see businesses take on this role, or is it really, given the role that it, as you've defined, it's something that we're not going to see for-profits
well, I think
or social enterprises?
Businesses can and should be advocates, and in some cases catalysts around collective impact on issues that are important for their business. I could give a number of examples, but I know we're running out of time. But I think they can be catalysts and champions, and they should be at the table because they have assets to bring to bear, and they've certainly got political influence and clout. But once they, I think as a backbone, you have to really be all about promoting the success of organizations that aren't your organization, as Mark said earlier. And I think that that sort of flies in the face of the DNA of most companies, and understandably so, because they're about profit. But I think we very much believe they should be catalysts and champions, and at the table, in sort of what we call the steering committee capacity, for example, and in helping to implement. But backbone is probably not an appropriate role for them.
Sure.
Mark, I think in the nutrition space, there's some interesting variations where I think we've seen some companies who've really taken on the shared value role in a big way have, in some cases, tried to perform a number of these collective impact roles. I think of DSM, for example, in the ingredients area, is actually been able to do quite a lot of things in a pre-competitive way. So there are not many of them, but there are a few who are starting, and I think it's be interesting to see is the shared value focus, I think, does start to provide an entry point to get to collective impact. And I do think there's a much greater predisposition amongst European companies in this space than in American, for example.
So let me just wind up, because we are running out of time here, with one question that I would like to pose to both Mark and Kat, which is, given all of your experience, what is the one important piece of advice or lesson learned that you would like to give to people listening to help them if they're just getting going? What's the one piece of advice that you wish you had known when you started? Let me start with Mark.
That's a hard question. I think it is really that, if one wants to aspire to this kind of role, it's really a long-term agenda that you have, and you have to start to build up the foundation to do that over 10 years at least. I think there's no, it's not a, and I think one needs to be investing quite a bit in planning and strategy and capacity development and building up a donor base. So I think that's the most important thing. It's really a long-term play, and you wouldn't go into this unless you really could have a line of sight to achieving some significant game-changing impact with this organizational structure. If you're looking at a much more modest impact, there are a lot of easier ways to get there than through a backbone play.
Kat, any piece of advice you'd give everybody?
I think it's fascinating that you said that, Mark, because I was going to say the same thing, that it really, you have to take the long-term view. You have to, set your sights far in advance and be prepared for times where it doesn't feel like, times where you're not seeing immediate impact. And you also have to be prepared for a lot of behind-the-scenes work. So I think, Mark, you said it really well. When you start out, you really need to have a long-term vision, and I think funders and organizations need to be very aware of this when hiring staff and really working to retain staff, because I think that long-term view, I think that's really facilitated by having longevity of staff in that backbone organization.
John, any one piece of advice you'd give? You know
Aim
too
big,
much.
But keep your head low.
Well, I want to thank everyone for sending in such great questions. I want to thank John, Mark, and Kat for taking the time to talk with us. I think it's been a really interesting discussion. Next slide, please. So as we conclude, again, thank you for joining us. Please fill out the survey that will appear when you exit this presentation. You can access this webinar as many times as you want over the next 12 months. If you would like a copy of the slide presentation, it is available for free. Simply click on the drop-down menu located below the photograph where the speakers have been appearing. If you haven't already read John's SSIR article, Channeling Change, Making Collective Impact Work, you can find it on SSIR's website, www.ssireview.org. If you want more information on FSG, or Collective Impact, please visit www.fsg.org and click on Collective Impact. There's a wealth of material up there. We had some questions come up about where can I find out more information about this. That's the place to go. Or contact FSG at info@fsg.org. To learn more about upcoming webinars that we might be offering, go to our website and sign up for our free email newsletter. Our next webinar is on April 25th. It is titled The Role of Brand in the Nonprofit Sector, presented by Christopher Stone and Natalie Kylander from Harvard University's Hauser Center for Nonprofit Organizations. That webinar is based on an article in our current issue. And you can sign up for that webinar soon at our website. Thank you again for participating.